We're so happy to have you with us here at the Herland Report, research professor emeritus at PRIO Institute in Oslo, Norway, discussing the war in Libya and the different wars in the Middle East, geopolitics, NATO, the changed role of NATO, and the effect of the changes of foreign policy in America ever since probably way before Paul Wolfowitz. We've seen such a dramatic change in the structure of NATO and its mission the past 20 years. What has really happened here?
After the Cold War, it was certainly a change, but something is still there, and there is a lot of misunderstanding about what NATO is. I think many people believe that NATO is some kind of umbrella organization for the Western world and the participation of everyone and so on. But it's more complicated, and the real power you will find in the capitals, in Washington, in London, and now perhaps also to some extent in Paris. And the intelligence capabilities are in these countries. So the NATO in Brussels has only a small intelligence office, actually, and they don't have to know very much of what happens. So, for example, a man I knew before, I mean, now he's dead, but Vidlek Eide, who was a Norwegian chief of defense in the late 80s and chairman of NATO Military Committee in the first half of the 90s, he said that the Americans and the British told him nothing. They decided a lot of things, or they told that one should do this or that, but why, they didn't tell. And the information he got that were of more sensitive or important kind, he got from the Norwegian military intelligence. So he was better informed as a chief of defense of Norway than as a chairman of NATO Military Committee. And this is something that many people don't understand, that NATO does not have to know why it starts war. I mean, NATO could easily start a war believing NATO top leadership when it comes to Libya. For example, Fogh Rasmussen, I don't know if Fogh Rasmussen knew really the background for the war, but he may very well have believed that he was supporting or protecting civilians. And this was not the case. The protecting civilians was not part of the reason for why US, Britain and France went to war. The reasons were very much the traditional colonial reason for influence of the African continent and access to oil and so on. These were the most important aspects of the war. But that is not what the people in Norway, for example, or Sweden or Denmark or so, would believe. And also, I mean, I know at least some of the the people in the government at the time, and they actually believed in the protection of civilians. But when you look at what happened in Benghazi, the French foreign minister said that, we just have a few hours. We have to save Benghazi. We have to do something now. And actually, there were only 14 tanks outside Benghazi from the Libyan government forces. And they could not take a city of 650,000. If one, imagine at least that large portion of the city supported the opposition. So that means that there were no threat to Benghazi.
I would agree with you, and when it comes to the Western population and the deception that we see happening, and that individuals within the Western population maybe would think that it was a righteous thing to do to go to war in Libya and so on, because as we know, over 90% of the American media is owned by only 6 corporations, and the same corporations have the same, you know, a part of them own also the weapons industry in the United States. So it's very easy, and this consolidation has happened since I think it is 83, where over 60 corporations own the American media. So this consolidation of power, of media power, has happened the past 20 years, and it has to have been done by somebody intentionally. And we see, when we look at the American democratic structure as well, the degree the lobby groups are into the, you know, into the power play when it comes to both Congress and the Senate, and the very rich in the United States, both on the conservative and the liberal side, fund different, you know, presidential candidates, for example. I mean, Bernie Sanders has spoken openly about this, and many others as well. There seems to be really an issue with the Western democracy. And looking then again at NATO, before we go into the Libyan issues, looking at NATO, which is an organization that has gone from being a defense organization to frankly, you know, some sort of an attack, you know, army that goes to war wherever, I guess, the neocons in the United States decide they are to go to war. It's just really, really deeply problematic that Europe does not have an independent foreign policy.
I think it was at the end of the Cold War. It was an ambition in Sweden, in Germany, to have to not subordinate themselves to the Anglo-American dominance, and to have some kind of independent voice. But that was lost, I think. And I think, for example, Olof Palme, when he was shot in '86, much of this ambition was lost, actually. And with Egon Bahr and Willy Brandt and so on in Germany, there were an ambition to have more of an independent voice for Europe. When they lost out totally, then they became much more under US-British dominance. And it happened. I think also that what happened after the Iraq War, that this has increased very much, and it has become a much more sophisticated approach to how to run wars. And this is what happened with the Libya war, where you included all the right wing, the left wing, in ambition to change a state. And this kind of instrumental relationship to states is not, you know, it's, one could at least hope that it will be some reflection after the Libya war, because it has been so catastrophic and such a disaster.
Yes, because you've spoken about this at length in your book about the Libya war, how rhetoric and lies destroy the state. And the role of the media, or the new role of the media, maybe as the first war in which we saw a complete one-sided media that worked on behalf of the warring parties, actually, also in the United States. But I've spoken to Senator, or former Senator, Ron Paul about this, because I asked him about the 1993 changes in American foreign policy, because, as you also address in your book, General Wesley Clark has spoken extensively about this on numerous occasions, how he was so shocked, as he was the four-star general that led the war in Kosovo, or in the Balkan at that time, And he was so shocked upon coming to the Pentagon and hearing that Donald Rumsfeld and that group with Dick Cheney and all were planning actually to take down, I believe it was 6 or 7 countries. First we take Somalia, then we take Syria, then we take Libya, like it was some sort of a joke. And of course there has been speculation that ever since the wall came down, I mean the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Union fell, there was some feeling of having one history that caused this kind of sentiment in the United States, that you can just crush whoever you want and survive and thrive. What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, it's tragic, I think. I think that many people thought about the end of the Cold War as some kind of a real detente process, that one could live together with each other, while central figures on the neoconservative side, and very explicitly by some people close to then CIA Director Casey, said that the whole thing was a deception. We fooled Gorbachev to have a kind of a agreement, and then we could move eastwards with our own forces. So it was, you invited Gorbachev to some kind of agreement between East and West, and that he also disarmed the forces, and then you say, bad luck. This was not really what we wanted. We wanted just to extend our forces to East Germany. That was what Herb Meyer, the personal advisor to Casey, said. So this faction actually fooled the Russians, and then they promised the Russians that they would not move NATO eastwards with 1 inch. And then you had a new government or new administration in the United States, and they just changed policy. The word wasn't worth anything. And that, you could say, was also the case with the Libya war. They fooled the Libyans with a kind of inclusion of Libya in the Western world, and then suddenly they just changed, and like this, and just started a war.
This is kind of cracking up, isn't it, today? We see the rise of the BRICS, the countries, we see the rise of Russia under Vladimir Putin, we see the rise of China, the geopolitical shift from the West to the East. When you speak to many of the Israelis today, they say, if you don't want our stuff in Intel, whatever, in Europe, that's fine by us. Just cash in all your cell phones, because our stuff is in all the cell phones. And they're saying in Israel now that they're doing, commerce much more with the Arab countries and towards the East. I mean, everything is being pushed towards the East. Even the oil in Saudi, the Americans don't need so much anymore. So even that, there's just the shift towards the East. I'm thinking too, the reflection on behalf of the West. What do you think you accomplish by crushing everybody?
I made a lot of interviews in China with people from the foreign ministry and from the military side, from the intelligence and so on. And the former head of Chinese intelligence, Huang Baifu, he said that we lost a lot in Libya. I mean, China had 30,000 people working there with infrastructure, with the roads and so on. And but then he said, but America lost more, because America lost a large part of the world, because there is no people who trust the Americans any longer in large part of the world. The case in Northern Europe may be different, because you could not imagine really that these kind of things happens. So many people in Europe are living in their own little world, so to speak. But I think there are changes going on in the world. But one should not underestimate the strength of the forces of the US and the Britain, actually.
I live in the Middle East and I see it very quite clearly. You know, I mean, most people are very aware of what is happening, unlike, you know, the Western population.
There will be some reflection, I think, in the Libya case is perhaps the most clear one, because the mass media was totally in favor of going to war. I mean, in Iraq it was different in a way. There were really some opposition that mattered, and but in Libya there were total consensus, and this is and now afterwards you could see that is also a total destruction of the state, and which, you know, if you look at the parliament of the small countries here in the north, they think really that, you know, they would imagine that it would be some kind of democracy, and that did not happen. It would become warrior factions and militias dominating the state totally, and the Islamist factions and so on. So it's a, and also if you go to the very strange thing, you could say that how it was possible to totally brainwash the European public, and about that it was you should protect civilians, and when what happened largely was the killing of black Africans in Libya. It was a kind of real attack on the black tribes in Africa. And if you look at the people who supported the war, was people who were against racism, people who were against genocide and killings and so on.
Well, are we really?
You know, you could say that, you know, if you look at some people in the parliament that were traditionally have been very much against war, have been very much against racism, and have been very much against any kind of genocide and these kind of things. And then suddenly they support the factions that were really the opposite of what you would imagine that they would support. And the interesting thing is how it was possible to make them believe this, and believe in the kind of operation in support of the very harsh Islamists that were, you know, very well connected with Al-Qaeda.
When you look at Libya, Muammar Gaddafi was known as a stern enemy of the Al-Qaeda and the Islamist groups. They also mention Mubarak. Of course, we know that corruption and many of the corruption issues in the Middle East and autocratic rulers really has been somewhat also the issue there. But also Mubarak, for example, and before him Nasser, spoke openly about the need to have an Islam that was open and that did not incorporate these kind of Islamist structures. So it's just also very strange to see how the defender of the black Libyans, who was Muammar Gaddafi, was the one actually targeted by the West, yet the Islamist groups known to be fighting in Afghanistan and here and there, and with their connections to the Saudis and whatnot, were the groups that actually were supported. So tragedy in what happened and the deception around all of this is really immense, also on behalf of the Western nations.
Yeah, certainly. I think that it's very much kind of, you know, you have to look at the media, how it functions, how it's possible that this could ever happen. You could say that what you do is to come up. I mean, you could look at the Dabashi, as you mentioned before, and also Mismari, top people on the Libyan side who were part of the rebellion. They came out with the lies, the very clear lies from the very first days. They said that it's African mercenaries killing people on the streets in Libya. They were saying that the genocide has already started. They said that Muammar Gaddafi is bombing his own people. These three lies they came up with the very first days. And you could say that these people would not be important enough to change the media of the bird. But it was immediately picked up by people as Senator McCain, as Joe Lieberman, with Hillary Clinton, that immediately said, this is what happened. The genocide is starting. We will have a new Rwanda. This is what the kind of discourse that were developed at the time. And this was already from the beginning. And that means that you have to go out with a false statement already from the first days, because otherwise something else might happen. So this means that you can change the media reality by coming up with some false statements from the very first days, and then it will be picked up by people on the top level. But this will not happen without some coordination. So that means that there are certain amount of coordination that already have taken place in beforehand.
This has to be true. There has to be some coordination, because when you look closely at the beginning of the Libyan, the 17th of February revolution in Libya, and you also see that the Russians confirmed that from the satellite pictures, and there was no attack by the Gaddafi forces. There is just such an immense amount of lies beginning with that. What they say they saw afterwards was that there was a group of mercenaries attacking the barracks, some military barracks in Benghazi. Then Gaddafi sent some forces in order to stop that. And as these forces have been seen then on the photographs, they were saying, look, he's coming to kill everybody. There was never a confirmation. And this comes from, I think it was Minister of Defense in the United States, Robert Gates, who stated at the time, and he stated in early March 2011, that the Pentagon had no confirmation that Gaddafi was bombing with planes, civilian areas. And then you go on to the Misrata incident, you go on from there to so many issues that have been proven in even the Pentagon speaking openly about it, yet it's not heard in the Western press. And this didn't used to be us. This didn't used to be what Western media was. This kind of one-sided narrative that we in the olden days used to call propaganda. This didn't used to be us.
No, you could say it's. I mean, what happened? It was a hearing in the Senate where Gates said that we have no confirmation, and Admiral Mullen, who was chairman of Joint Chief of Staff, I mean the top chief of defense in U.S., he said we have no confirmation whatsoever of air attacks on civilians. So this is quite clear that this was the defense intelligence in U.S., their conclusion. There were no attacks on civilians. And while there was nothing of that in the Western media. And the Western media was dominated by these few statements that came up and what further used by Hillary Clinton and John McCain and so on. And I think Robert Gates said, for example, that I will not, as Secretary of Defense, he said that he was asked about if he would accept US soldiers in Libya. And he said, not as long as I'm in this office. And 1 month later, he announced his resignation. 2 months later, he left his office. So it was and he said that it was Hillary Clinton who decided to go for the war. And a hesitant President Obama decided to go on the side of Hillary Clinton. That's what happened.
And so many issues pertaining to the Libyan situation were not addressed at all. For example, we know 2007 George Bush stood up and said that Muammar Gaddafi was an excellent example of how a leader should be. A few years later, the very opposite is heard. And it's been hidden quite well that I think it is 95% of the Libyan population. Oh, look, from the time Muammar Gaddafi came to power up to the time he died, the reading abilities, literacy rate in Libya went from I think around 10% to 95%. Education was free. This was a socialist state. Education was free for both men and women. If women wanted to get an education in Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, that was not available to them in Tripoli or Benghazi or Misrata, wherever. They could go to London or wherever, and the Libyan state would pay for them. There were thousands, and Saif al-Islam, Gaddafi's son, was responsible for building thousands of blocks of housing, taking many of the people that didn't have proper housing into a new situation, into the modern world. Look at the big river dam. I mean, over 70% of the Libyan people got their water from that dam, which was built by Gaddafi. So, and as we know, I'm just repeating the facts for the sake of the viewer, that you know, Libya was considered a middle-income country by the UN, and the living standard was higher than in Italy and Australia, or I think it was
higher than Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania, and so on, the eastern part of Europe. But that's good enough, so to speak. It was higher. It was certainly highest in Africa, and it was also higher than certain Latin American countries. So and now it's just down. So it's total destruction of the state, and the welfare state as was emerging in Libya, and you could say it was not the kind of freedoms that you would prefer in some Nordic countries, but you could, and Muammar Gaddafi became certainly very paranoid, but it was also reasons for that, because there were several tens of incidents trying to kill him, from the French, from the British, and from the Americans. And when they shot down, the French shot down in 1980, they shot down an Italian passenger plane because they thought it was the plane that Gaddafi was using, and 87 people were killed. So and it was a number of cases where they used Chad and Egypt for the fighting, and they had what in 87 they had was the so-called Toyota War, the first Toyota War. That was the US and the French organized to attack on Libya from Chad, and they used small Toyota pickups, which was extremely efficient with quite good weaponry, and they took back a part of Libya and so on, and this was interesting because this was the same kind of war that they started in 2011. they knew that these kind of instruments, these kind of Toyota pickups were very, very efficient in the sands of Libya. So this was, you know, it was not just something that happened. Suddenly, there were, you know, hundreds of pickups, small trucks, so to speak, with very good weaponry in Libya. It just turned up there suddenly and then used against the government. And the NATO forces were, according to their own estimates, they were able to destroy 1/3 of the Libyan military forces in just a couple of weeks by bombing. So this was, I mean, it's very clear that without two things, without the Qatari, Emirati, Sudanese, Jordan forces on the one hand, and the NATO bombing, there were no way that the rebels would have any chance of winning in Libya.
Thank you very much, Professor Ola Tunander, for taking the time to join us here at the Herland Report, and thank you also for writing the book about the Libya War, how deception and lies destroyed the state. Thank you.
Thank you.